I may be a little off this morning, a little off. I woke up, it was one of these things, you ever wake up in the middle of the night and you can't go back to sleep? I'm a bad sleeper anyway, I don't sleep well. And I get up at an ungodly early hour. I get up at 4:30 every morning, so it's really early. And so the sleep I get is important. And last night I woke up at, 20 after 2. And it was like an hour before I could go back. And I know I went back because I forgot the time. I looked at the clock and it was like 20 after 4. So I know I went. But so it's rough when you start the day and you're on fumes. And that's kind of what I'm feeling. I'm feeling like I'm running on fumes today, at 10:30 in the morning. So be patient, because
be kind.
Be kind and gentle, and don't ask me anything really hard. I'll do the best I can do. Well, if you do, be gentle when I have to pause for a while and just look at you slack jawed and say,
Been there, done that. I'll be back. I got all my notes.
Yes, you do. You can ask your hard questions.
Well, if you ask hard, if I say, I don't know, I'll have to look it up. Be gentle.
You know what? That's sometimes the best answer.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Honest answer.
Yeah. Well, there was a guy that said, we'd come to my studies, and he passed away a few years ago in Word. And he was an agnostic. Mm-hmm. He was an agnostic, and he came to talk to me about being an agnostic. And he ended up joining the church, which was kind of interesting. And I remember talking, and he'd come to all the studies. And I remember talking to him one time, and I said, "Well, why have you gotten involved?" And he was in his 70s, so he wasn't a kid. Mm-hmm. And he says, because you said something I'd never heard a pastor say. Oh. And I thought, oh man, I took out a pen, okay, let it loose because I want to remember what it is. And he said, you, in an early conversation, maybe our first one, I had a question, and you said, I don't know. Oh. And he said, that really impressed me. Because the pastors I know, they always knew. They always had an answer. And sometimes it didn't make any sense, but they always had an answer. And he said, when you said, I don't know, I was impressed. And I said, well, I probably didn't. I don't think I did know. So I don't know can be an excellent response, especially when you don't know.
Especially when it comes to God's Word.
Yeah.
I had written down that it's important to have clarity to what truth is. And so rather than speaking go back to the Word of God.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what's so important about Bible study, because I hear from everybody, and we put it out there, and we all reframe it back to what we're learning. Mm-hmm. And that's how we learn. And I don't care how old you are, you're never going to know it all. No.
Absolutely, and it's constantly new.
That's what we're here for. New
ideas are being produced in the Word. That Spirit is constantly re-inspiring. Mm-hmm. That's what Paul says in 1 Timothy. So anyway, we are coming close to the end of the David stories, and David becomes king.
Yep.
Right, and how would you describe his early kingship?
Very good.
Very, very good. And what are some of the very, very good things that we see in his early kingship?
He cares about the people.
Oh, he cares about the people. And he really does, because he feeds them. My gosh. So he cares about the people. What else shows that his kingship is really, really good at the beginning?
He talks to God.
He talks to God a lot. Okay? So he's good to the people. He talks to God. What else? Now again, when we think it from the writer's perspective, what does the writer use to indicate his kingship is solid at the beginning? So he's caring for the people, he's talking to God.
Builds a city and brings the ark back.
Builds his city or conquers a city, makes it his. and brings the Ark of the Covenant from the garage where they were keeping it into the city, right? So that's happening. What else does he do for Israel, this now united confederation of tribes? Remember the big threat that was always in the background with Saul? Not talking about his character, but the external threat. Philistines were always there with Saul. Always there with Saul. And what does David end up doing with the Philistines? He defeats them and they leave. And the Ammonites defeats them, they leave. One goes west, one goes east. So Israel is secure. So David has the characteristics of, or as he's presented, as he's a good king. We also don't want to remember that one of the things that Samuel says early on, when the people say we want a king, is Samuel says what? You remember what Samuel says when the people want a king, when we're coming out of Judges and that chaotic period with Judges, and the people say to Samuel, we want a king. You remember how Samuel responds?
No, you don't.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Why don't the people want a king?
Take your things and take your family.
They're going to take your family. They're going to take your things. They're going to enslave you. They're going to tax you. And you don't need it because God can be your king. And
Up to that point, God was.
And through the Judges, God was. And that was that interesting when we get to the end of Judges, that interesting interplay, because you have, and we see it in this too. You've got those strains of tradition that say kings are really good. Kings are really good. And you have that other strain that says kings are really bad. They're really bad. And you see both of them working their way in at the end of Judges. Because remember, in Judges talked about time, the writer, at least of one strand of the tradition, it says, the people were running crazy because this was the time before they had a king. Like, if they had a king, they wouldn't be running crazy. And then, a chapter later, Samuel's saying, no, be careful what you want because kings aren't really good. So you have that kind of working together. Anyway, David becomes an example of a good, or almost establishes an example of what a good king is. And so things are going well for David. People are happy. The country is religious. Then what? He makes bad decisions, and he makes one bad decision that sort of gets the ball rolling. And what is the bad decision he makes? He doesn't go to war. When other kings go out to war, David stayed in Jerusalem. And from that point, what happens?
It's just one thing after another.
One thing after another. And what is what's the progression? What's the timeline?
When he sees Bathsheba.
Okay, he's hanging around the house, has nothing to do because he should be fighting, and he isn't. He's just sitting around, got nothing, and sees Bathsheba, and since he's bored, brings Bathsheba. And what happens? And he could have covered that up, but got pregnant, now that's a problem.
Because she's married.
Okay, she's married, now that's now he's got a problem. Now, at any point, he could have said, God, I've done wrong, I'll take the consequences, I don't want this to get any bigger. But David decides to do what human beings tend to decide to do, which is, I'm going to cover it up. How can I cover it up? And he does his best to cover this up, right? And his best is not good enough. And what's kind of interesting when you read this with Uriah, David is supposed to be this paragon. He's an example of a good, righteous king. And he's doing this to get out of trouble. And Uriah, who's a foreigner, a Hittite, he ends up being noble. He's the one that's noble. David isn't. David's a sleaze, trying to cover this up. But Uriah is, no, I won't. I cannot be with my wife, where my comrade in arms on the field. So, you know, he's the paragon, not David. You know, David's kind of a mess. And finally, what does David decide he's got to do to cover it up?
Kill him.
Got to kill Uriah. And how does he do that?
Somebody else do it.
Yeah, and you know, even the way he chooses to do it is awful. Because, I mean, good gracious, I guess if he were going to be a man, confront Uriah and do it yourself. But he doesn't even do that. He gets with Joab, right? And this scheme that you're going to fight and then everybody retreats except Uriah, and Uriah's going to die. Because he's still trying to cover all of this stuff up. And Uriah ends up dying, and David does.
Mary's Bathsheba.
Yeah, marries Bathsheba, and, you know, awaits the birth, you know, of their child. So it's a terrible, terrible story about David.
But isn't that a story of a lot of people? I
Oh, I think-
I'm relating so much to
Sure.
this. It's like, that's humanity.
Yeah.
And so, if he was at war where he should have been, that was his first bad choice, his mind would have been occupied doing the war, which was what he was supposed to be doing
Right,
as king.
right.
He stayed home. The lusts of the flesh took over. That's the enemy's territory. And we all have the lusts of the flesh of different reasons, not always sexual. And so he fell into that trap, and it just seemed to multiply itself because he's trying to cover it up for his own self-righteousness.
Absolutely.
In front of the eyes of God and the people.
Right.
So
Yep.
I found the study of David so much of humanity that we can relate to ourselves, and I just found that parallel.
Oh, I think that's a good parallel.
Well,
I think it's
true.
and a cautionary tale, because the consequences, because it's not without consequence, right?
All right.
Because what ends up happening? So David, by appearances, would appear to have gotten away with it, but does David get away with it? No, of course not. Not in this story, because who knows? God knows, of course. And through Nathan, the prophet, David is confronted. And it's kind of interesting, after David is confronted with the little thing, and recognizes, comes as close as he's going to come, well, I guess you could say, and maybe this is something else that we can kind of think about it as we look at our own lives. Even though David says, I've done wrong, he confesses, he cries, he, mourns, he does all this stuff, but he still pays the consequences of his actions. The consequences, God doesn't say, well, since you're sorry, I'll let you off the hook this time. There are consequences. Behavior has consequences. Right. And it doesn't matter how much you whine and complain, behavior has consequences. And he does, and it does, because the first consequence is the child dies. And then, because Nathan said, you're going to have problems in your house. Does he have problems in his house? Mm-hmm. Oh boy. He starts having problems in his house. And as he responds to the problems in his house, how is the character of David presented? I mean,
It weakens.
Yeah, he becomes a weaker character. He doesn't become wicked. And Saul became kind of desperate. But David doesn't become desperate or evil. He just becomes really weak. Because everybody seems to be manipulating him. Yeah, and he seems pretty much clueless about what the machinations other people are creating that kind of use him. And ultimately what ends up happening, because he has trouble with his daughter and his son, and you got all this intrigue in the family, and what's sort of the end to that little story? What did we talk about last week?
Well, David left. He had to
Okay,
flee the country.
right, because after Absalom kills his brother because of what his brother did to his sister, you have all that little thing. But David, because he's so sad, brings him back. And Absalom is not, as for the reader, what is our impression of Absalom?
He's not good.
He's not good. He may have stood up, took vengeance for his sister. He ain't good. Because remember, he would be at the gate, and when people came to appear before David for judgment, he'd say, David doesn't care about you. Let me solve your case. He's not a good, and we're talking about a son, doing this. Eventually, this son, Absalom, does what?
Kills his brother.
Well, he kills his brother. What else does he do towards his father? Yeah, he becomes king. He has himself anointed king and rebels against his father. And his father ends up doing what? Fleeing Jerusalem. The guy was throwing rocks at him as he was fleeing and cursing him because he's from Benjamin. And so David has to leave. And Absalom's got an army, and it's going to find a lot of complicated, behind the scenes soap opera-ish stuff going on, inside of the court. The skinny, when we entered chapter 18 last week, what ends up happening? So you have an army, Amasa leading the army of Absalom. You have Joab leading the army of David. Remember, they told David, don't participate in the battle, stay at the city, wait for news. And David says, heck no, I'm the king, I should be leading you in battle. David says,
I'll do
okay, whatever you want me to do, I'll do. And so he hangs out at the city gate, and his army goes out, and Absalom's army goes out, and what happens?
Job kills Absalom.
Well,
Before that.
right there we got the defeat, right? At the Israel, because you've got Israel, and then you have. But remember, Absalom is from the tribe of Judah, and that becomes really important in what we're looking at today. So Absalom isn't affiliated with the other 10 tribes; he's affiliated with Judah, as David's son. So it's not this Israel versus Judah deal. It's sort of within the family. Okay, so Absalom's army is defeated, right? And David's army wins. All right? And David is where?
At the gate.
At the gate, sitting, waiting. Right?
Wait here.
Waiting to hear. Now, Absalom, after the battle is over, his army defeated. Big, huge defeat, right? What does Absalom do? What does he attempt to do?
He's fleeing.
He attempts to get away from the battle, right? Because they're going to kill him, right? And he's trying to get away riding a mule. Yeah. As he's going, what happens to Absalom? But that the writer has thrown in earlier, and you read it and you say, oh, well, that's nice to know information. The guy has a lot of hair. What happens to him as he's fleeing? His hair gets caught in a tree. It's happened to me so many times.
But your mule ran off out from under you,
Yeah,
right?
then my mule ran off, and I was hanging there.
Maybe your lawn tractor. Tangled up in the branches.
Yes, that's never happened to me. I've never had to worry about my hair getting caught in a tree. So there would be advantages if I weren't like Absalom. So anyway, Absalom gets caught in the tree. Now remember, and this is also kind of pathetic, as Joab is taking his army to fight, and remember he's divided the army into 3 parts, and to fight Absalom, to get his army focused on this battle coming up. What is the command? I'm sorry, she did that. You're okay. I'll protect you. You're all right. What does David say? And again, this is a writer who is shaping this story. So he's not stupid. He's putting in things that he's going to bring back later. And he's not a reporter writing stuff down. He's shaping a story. What does David say? The last words of David to his generals.
To be gentle.
Be gentle with my son Absalom. Now, they've already established that David has a soft spot for Absalom, because when Absalom kills his brother Amnon, David doesn't feel a lot of grief for Amnon, but he feels a lot of grief that Absalom isn't around anymore. So much that Joab brings him back, Okay, so be gentle with my son. All right, Absalom's hanging from a tree from his hair. All right, what ends up happening in that situation? How does Joab find out Absalom is hanging from a tree? Somebody tells him. Somebody sees it and goes to Joab and says, "Oh, by the way, you'll never believe what I saw. Absalom is hanging from a tree." And Joab, of course, tells that soldier,
He wants to pay him too.
"Yeah, why didn't you kill him? He's hanging from a tree. This is your chance. Why didn't you kill him?" And the soldier says, how does the man respond?
He was afraid of the king.
Can't do it. Not going to do it. And because this man has two really interesting, which again, it opens a little bit, that again, I think the writer is very intentional in this, opens a little window into a character that's involved in this story. The man says first, when Joab said, "Well, why didn't you kill him?" The man says, "No, I couldn't because..."
King's son.
King's son. And I heard, I happened to be there when the king was giving you instructions, to be gentle with him. And I am not going to raise my hand, knowing that the king said, "Be gentle with my son." What else does he say? Which is really interesting, not a shocker, but again opens a little window onto Joab.
Because you're not going to have my back.
You're not going to have my back. When the king finds out that I did it, you're not going to back me. You're not going to back me. Which we, the reader, are saying, "Oh, okay, yeah, he's probably right." Because what has Joab done to this place in the story? I mean, he's been a general, but what has he done? Remember, he killed Abner, Saul's general, after chasing him. Now I've lost my train of thought. He killed, what else did he do? He killed Abner.
He helped kill Uriah.
Yes, that's what I was trying to get. He was complicit in the plan, and he knew exactly what he was doing with Uriah. He was involved with Uriah. Joab, he's a questionable guy. I don't know that you want to put too much faith in Joab. And remember, after Uriah, Joab does that, and I think that's really neat. He says to the young man that goes back to tell David Uriah's dead, sort of remind him that I know some stuff. Remind David that I know background on why he died. It's really very interesting. So anyway, this is what the man says, and what does Joab do?
Kills Absalom.
He kills Absalom, and he kills Absalom with three spears. And so what has Joab done?
Went against the king. He didn't listen to what he was told.
He didn't listen to the king. Now, you could say, well, his motivation was to protect the king because the king has a soft spot for Absalom, and this is an act to protect the king.
Not his place.
But it's not his place. He's disobeying the king. So there's a problem with Joab. Now, what does Joab end up doing after this? What does Joab do?
They threw him in a pit.
Okay, Joab calls his troops back together. They're going to throw him in Absalom in a pit. And what do they do in that pit? Because they don't just throw him in a pit. They cover him with rocks, so they cover him with rocks, and this stands in contrast with how Absalom saw his future, his coming funeral. what does the writer sort of just throw in there about Absalom's burial plans?
Absalom had taken the
Oh,
town.
beautiful.
Yes, he'd already built a monument for, who did he build it for?
Himself.
He built it for himself. And he built it for himself because
You know, son.
he didn't have any sons. And so if you don't have sons to carry on after you, you build a big statue. Right there. So Absalom doesn't end the story with any nobility either. But Joab certainly doesn't look good. And of course, we've seen this several times. The writer says what? At the end of that little.
It's still there.
It's still there. And so what is the writer doing? Or better, when I say redactor, you know what I mean. He's not creating stories. He's shaping stories. And that's what a person called a redactor does. He shapes stories that already exist. So by throwing that in there, what is he doing for the reader? What does that do for the reader? It doesn't do anything for us because we're not there. But the reader, by saying, oh, and that statue is still there. What is that?
Giving it validity.
Yeah, it's giving validity. It's giving it validity. It sort of brings the person into the story a little bit. It's true because every now and then, the stones are still there. The statue is still there. So you can sort of feel a connection to the story. Okay. Now, what ends up happening? So Absalom is dead. Somebody's going to have to do what?
Tell him.
Somebody's going to have to tell David. And so what is the plan on telling David?
Joab sent somebody else to do it.
Okay, the son of Zadok. And Zadok is what?
Priest.
It's a priest. The son of Zadok says, I'll carry the news and tell David. And Joab says, it's not always, it's a mixture. The son is dead. Maybe somebody else should do it. And so who does he send? He sends a slave, a Cushite. And Cushite is foreigner. He sends a foreigner to go tell David. But what eventually ends up happening?
That son of Zadok went also.
Okay, they both are running together.
Yeah.
Okay. And so they're both running to tell David that, and this isn't unusual. This is what they did in the ancient world. That's why they call that race a marathon, because that's what a runner did. He ran from the battlefield of Marathon back to Athens to announce that the Athenians had won. And that was his job. And that was good news. In fact, that's called euangelion, which is translated good news, gospel. That was good news because it meant the enemy wasn't going to besiege your city. So you could sort of relax. And that's how you got information. So these two runners are going back, and David is sitting at the gates, right? And who does he see? Sees these two guys running, right? And who does he recognize first?
The son of Zadok.
Okay, he recognizes the son of Zadok, right? And what does this guy tell David? What's the first bit of news he gets? Enemies, he has done exactly what he's supposed to. He has announced what the Greeks called euangelion, which is good news. That's what he's done. He's announced that the enemy's defeated. We can relax a little bit because they're not going to come after us now. But what's the first question David has? Doesn't ask about the battle, doesn't ask about how many men he's lost, doesn't ask about the condition of the enemy, where they are, what's going to happen, yada, yada, yada. What's his first question?
Is Absalom.
Tell me about Absalom. And what does, yes?
I just want to back up a little bit because I have written here why. Question mark.
Yeah, why?
So why did the priest ran and then he sent his son Cushi? Why both ran to tell the same news? What was the reason? I didn't get it.
What would seem to be the reason that you ended up having the two people go? Because it appears as though Joab just wants the Cushite. Why does the priest's son end up going? Remember, he really insists on going. After the Cushite, he says, I'm going to go. I need to go. And Joab sort of says, then go.
Right.
Does he think the king will, look favorably on him because he brought the news?
Well, what would be the advantage of having a foreigner announce it?
Well, in reading here in my little side notes, because remember whenever they brought the news before to Saul that had they brought him news that somebody was killed and he killed the... Right. He killed the messenger.
Right. So send a foreigner, if the reaction is negative,
Kill the messenger.
a Cushite, they're Cushites, they're a foreigner. But the priest's son,
Had some merit.
that could be a real problem, especially since David, the writer has already established, David seems more concerned about his son than he is about the outcome of the battle. That seems to be a big deal. So if you're going to announce a defeat, you're better to have a foreigner do it. And what's really interesting is based on what the priest's son says, because when he asks, how is Absalom? What does the son of the priest say?
It was confusing.
Yeah, he says, all I know is they were talking about something when I left, but I'm not sure what it is. So he either doesn't know or he's not telling that Absalom is dead. Now, Joab is sad because when the priest's son was there, he knew, but the priest's son's not telling him that his son is dead. Now, why he doesn't tell him, I don't know. Because he did know, because Joab told him that Absalom was dead, but he doesn't tell David. Who gets the job of telling David that his son is dead? The Cushite ends up getting the message that Absalom is dead. And how does David receive the news?
He goes upstairs to weep.
Yeah. He ends up going upstairs and weeps. And as he's weeping, because again, the writer is giving us details. He's shaping this story. What is David doing he said, if we went upstairs to weep, that would be kind of dramatic. But, father, son, that kind of jazz. But what is David doing as he's weeping?
He's mourning so much. He's saying, God, I would rather give my life for David. If it was I would rather give my life than my son's Absalom. That's how
Absalom. Oh, my Absalom.
Yeah.
If you had taken me instead. Now, this is a king, right? Mm-hmm. Who is responsible for a nation, right? And an army. And his son Absalom has rebelled against him and was looking to kill him. So he's mourning. Now, who ends up intervening?
Joab.
Okay, Joab ends up intervening because Joab hears what?
Here's what he's saying.
He heard about the...
Yeah, somebody tells Joab that the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. Now, what's the result of the king weeping? Because the writer tells us that David's actions here have consequences. What's the consequences of David mourning so much for his son Absalom?
He humiliated his people because he put the loss of his son ahead of the victory of the battle.
Who is he humiliating? He's humiliating his soldiers. That it's as though his soldiers, instead of rejoicing that they had won this victory, he's humiliating them as though they had done something wrong. And so instead of feeling an exhilaration, having won this great victory, fighting for a king that they love. They were fighting for him. I mean, it would have been easy for them not to, because Absalom, he had the power. He was in Jerusalem. He was, in essence, the king. And instead of fighting for him, they were fighting for David. And here David is making them feel ashamed. And his army, after this great victory, now is also in mourning. You know, they're in mourning after a victory. And so what does Joab remind David?
They saved your life and your family's lives.
These guys that you are really bringing down, you're bringing to shame, they were the ones that saved your life and the life of your family. It's like they don't matter to you. You don't even care. Because if we hadn't won this victory, if we hadn't beaten Absalom, what? If they had lost, all the soldiers would be dead.
Right.
These soldiers that you were making feel as though they did something wrong, they would be dead. If the outcome of what you said, you know, oh, if I had died instead of Absalom, if your result, if you had gotten your wish, the thing you're saying right now, your army would be dead right now. Every man would have been dead.
I love the anger of Joab to the king.
Yes.
Because these words that I'm reading are angry. And he says,
Sure.
and I'm just going to read what it says. It says, now therefore arise. He's just telling him, he's telling the king, go forth and speak comfortably unto your servants, for I swear by the Lord. Those are angry words.
You better believe it.
He means what he's saying. If thou go forth, there will not tarry. If you do not go forth, there will not be one left to support you.
What is Joab? How is Joab acting?
Like
When
king.
he's what?
Like the king.
That's exactly what he's doing.
Right. He's
That
got
is exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
He's acting like a king. David
He's weak.
is not. David is not acting like a king, but Joab is. Now, we still got all this stuff with Joab floating around, but Joab is acting more king-like than David. And what happens after that?
Well, David got himself up and took his place
Yeah.
in the gateway.
And reviews the troops. You know, he's sitting there and reviews the troops. So David ends up doing what?
Acting like a king.
David, why is he acting like a king?
Because he was told.
Because he was told to.
Oh, okay.
He was told to. You know, David, it doesn't suggest that David, you know, came to himself and realized, you know, Joab, it's like in those movies, you know, where the guy shakes him. You gotta, you know, get out there and act like you're the boss.
But wasn't he about the best friend the king should have had?
Well,
Because he spoke truth?
It is, and yet we also see Joab tends to also act in his own self-interest. Joab isn't separated from his own self-interest, you know. And Joab, I think in some ways, we've seen a character similar, certainly far more extreme than Joab, but had some similar characteristics earlier in the story of Joab, considering some of the things Joab did, like killing Abner, like killing Absalom. Who else? Sort of, only when Joab does it, it seems more intentional. There's more intention behind it. Remember Saul, one of the things that Saul got in trouble was he tended to kind of be impetuous. Yeah, he acted without thinking. I don't think Joab acts without thinking. I think Joab knows exactly what he's doing. I think he does it with intention. And what his intention is, don't know. But he certainly is protecting David. But he has no qualms about disobeying David. And he has no qualms about shaking David down if he thinks he's going to get in trouble. Because that's what he does with Uriah. You know. And the person knows that Joab, because he assumes Joab's not going to watch his back. So he takes a seat, troops are reviewed, David has avoided this. Now, what else is going on? So David has won this victory, but the reality is, he may have won this victory, but he's lost his country, right? Because what have this confederation of tribes, what did they do before this victory?
They moved into Jerusalem.
Yeah, when they moved in, who were they supporting?
David's city.
Yeah, they were supporting Absalom. Absalom became the king of Israel, and the tribes came to him, including Judah. So David may have won this victory, but he really isn't king yet. What then ends up happening? So we've still got this problem. We got these tribes in rebellion against David. They just don't have a leader anymore. What do they end up doing?
Scattered.
Okay, they end up fleeing, and as they're fleeing, though, they start talking to one another, right? And what do they start saying to one another?
Well, they were talking about David had fled, that Absalom was killed. And
Okay.
Why don't we bring David?
Yeah, maybe. Remember, David was pretty good with the Philistines, right? He freed us from the Philistines, and we followed Absalom, and Absalom is now dead under a pile of rocks. Maybe we should bring David back, right? Now, what does David want before he'll come back? What does David want? Because remember, we're talking about a confederation, tribal confederation, 12 tribes. What does David want before he'll agree to come back?
He wants Judah to agree to
Okay.
bring him back too.
Wants Judah to sort of spearhead this. Judah's going to be the leader of this. And who does he talk to?
The priests. Is that
He talks to the priests, and he talks to Amasa. And Amasa is important because who is Amasa?
Another one of his nephews.
Yeah, where was Amasa's loyalty?
Absalom.
He was loyal to Absalom. So, and again, we're talking about Judah because Absalom is Judah. That David, I'll come back, but Judah's going to spearhead this. Judah's going to be the leader, and I'm going to make an appeal to Absalom's general. I want him on my side. Okay, now if Amasa is going to support David, now we've got how many commanding generals? We have two. When you have two commanding generals, you have one too many, right? You got one too many. So, but he's doing that, and why does that make sense that he would appeal to Amasa? Why would he want Amasa on his side?
He wants the support of Absalom's followers.
Remember, Judah went with Absalom first, and then the other tribes. He's won a victory, but he doesn't have a country. He's got to get Judah back first, and then start working on the other tribes and finding the one that has power. Since Absalom is gone, Amasa's the only one he can go to. He's the one, and so he ends up appealing to him. Now we kind of file that away because that's going to be a problem. That's going to be an issue. So, who else is there? A guy we have seen before.
Joab.
What's that?
They were talking about Joab.
We're talking about Joab. I'm thinking of when we get to 16. verse 16.
Oh, okay. Shimmy.
Now,
I
what-
remember this.
Yeah, Shema. What about Shema? When have we seen him before? We did see him before.
He was throwing rocks.
He was the one throwing rocks at him. He was the Benjaminite that was throwing rocks at David as David was leaving, right? And he was throwing rocks because why was Shema the Benjaminite throwing rocks at David?
Because of what David had done to his people.
Yeah, done because Saul was a Benjaminite. You know, we had a Benjaminite as king. You overthrew him, your fault. Now you're in big trouble. I'm going to stalk you and throw rocks at you and curse your name. Okay? And so he shows up. And what does he end up doing? Shema do? What does he do?
He went down to Judah to meet the king.
Yeah, that's right. And he says what? What does he do when he meets the king? King
He
David.
fell prostrate.
Oh, I am so sorry. Oh, it was terrible, awful. You know, I regret my actions, my prior actions. And David ends up, although what is he really concerned? Or what do David's advisors suggest that David do as a way to show that he's in control?
Put him to death.
Put him to death. I mean, this guy was throwing rocks at you and was shouting nasty things to you as you were going. You know, maybe you need to behavior has consequences. What does David do? No, well, I'm not going to do it.
What's that?
You know, okay.
I'm struggling with, you've portrayed David as big weak ever since
Right,
Bathsheba and
Right.
the whole cascade.
right.
But it's also a quality that he showed a long time ago, that he's compassionate.
Well, he is compassionate.
Because I see mercy there too.
He's
But
still
and
compassionate.
he certainly does. What would be the difference here? Because when the person came with both with announcing Saul that he had killed Saul and then Saul's son.
Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Not Jonathan. The other son that took charge and ruled.
Abner's.
When brought the head. In both cases, you know, David didn't show. That wasn't mercy. Wasn't, you know, that's a merciful thing. David was just. And I think if you
That was toward the Lord's anointed.
yeah, well, but he showed justice to the person. Well, the man who was throwing rocks was doing what? Throwing rocks at God's anointed. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, and I think, and that may be from a 21st century perspective. This becomes a sign of mercy.
Now, David is going to show him mercy because David had sinned, so he knows the consequences of it, and this man sinned against him, so if he forgives him, they're in the same.
Yeah,
Let's start fresh.
and can kings do that? No, kings can't really do that.
No, but I think that's what he's
But
saying.
That certainly could. I think what we're seeing is I think what's being conveyed isn't that necessarily that he's merciful, and I may be wrong in the way I'm reading it, but that he's being merciful. In the rest of this story, sometimes, you know, when the guy comes with the king's head, even though that helps you, you know, justice says he goes. He has to go. If somebody's throwing rocks at God's anointed and curses his name, you know, behavior has consequences. And
The other
maybe
way
he's
to
got to
look at
go.
this too is, all through this, you know, all right, David is weak and he's not acting very kingly.
Mhm.
And so, I'm kind of like with the mercy thing here. And so, but also, so if he was king, he'd kill him. But he has never been acting like a king for the past few.
Right.
And all of a sudden now
That's right.
he's showing what I see as mercy.
Right.
So he's not acting kingly because he's not kingly. And maybe God's working in him.
If that were the case, then we should see it. Then the writer would tell us that God was moving this, because the writer tells us what we want to know. I agree with you.
Okay.
This is in character to the David we have just seen, that we've been looking at. And if this is, and it may be a sign of this is a bright spot, in the story, maybe. This doesn't help him in any way, doesn't enhance his kingship in any way, other than maybe people say but the writer doesn't say, word spread that David showed justice. And if that were the case, then the writer probably would have included that. Instead, we've got David disregarding the advice that he's getting and not killing someone who did something that justified, certainly in this context, justified death. And David's choosing not to do it. Now, again, that we could take it in a lot of different ways. That's what I think. That's the way I would interpret it. And what happens in the next little story? Because we've got these two paired. And what occurs in the next story? Which I find even worse. In verse 24. So we have this little story about the guy throwing rocks at him. And David says, okay, you're forgiven. And then the next one is Saul's grandson, right? And I'm not pronouncing his name because I fumble over it every time I try to do it. But his grandson's name, right, who has the bad foot, the cripple. Remember what he did earlier? Because remember, David showed him mercy, and would amaze us, son of, grandson of Saul, son of David, Jonathan. David certainly could have eliminated competition. This is when David was king, decisive, not going to kill you. Instead, Ziba is going to manage your properties. And that. What does this guy do?
Stayed with Absalom.
He turned and went to Absalom, and the writer even tells us why he did it. You remember why he decided when Absalom took power in Jerusalem, why this grandson of Saul went? Because he was hoping he'd be king. That's what it said. That they would restore the house of Saul. So Absalom, would eventually fall, and he could step into kingship. And remember, that's what Ziba goes and tells David. My master has gone over to the enemy. And remember what David says to Ziba?
He gave
Gave all of the property. Because of what he did, you will get all the property. So this guy turned against David, right, to support Absalom. All right, he goes to David, and what does he say? What's his story?
That he didn't want to be a burden, and that he gave him a reason for it.
Oh, yeah. I've had a hard life, and, you don't hold it against me. And we know what he did. He turned against the one who saved his life, right? Mm-hmm. And what does David do? Which, again, I think is a sign of this continuing, breakdown in David. Declining it. What does David do?
He orders he and Ziba to divide the land.
He's given Ziba the land because the guy he serves betrayed David. And now what does David do?
He's giving it back.
I'm going to take half of what I gave you and give it back to the guy who betrayed me. And in fact, in this little story, who shows the closest thing to nobility?
Ziba's.
The grandson of Saul, who says what?
He can have everything.
Yeah, he should have everything. Given what I did to you, he deserves everything. Don't divide it. Don't take half of what now belongs to him and give it to me. Given what I did, he should get it all. It strikes me, and again, this is just the way I'm reading it. David wins this victory. So we might be tempted in this story to say, okay, he's won this victory, David's back. David's back. But then I think he drops in two stories. This reminds us that David's not back. He's not the king he was. He's not this decisive ruler. He's still what? And remember, why is this happening to David? The consequence of his actions. This is in consequence of his actions. It's not just that he has a brain worm or something. This is in consequence to his actions. Okay, so we've got these two little stories that are just dropped in here. Then you start asking, well, why? Why are these stories in here? Well, I think it's to show that David still isn't king-like, but it may be other reasons. But we get back to the main stream, right? Because David has not come back to Jerusalem yet. He's still across the river because he had to get out of the country because Absalom, remember, he went east of the Jordan to get away from Absalom. So he's got to come back, right? And the tribes want him back. Judah wants him back. Amasa on his side. What's the situation as he's approaching the Jordan? What's that? It's a kind of an odd little story.
About the old man.
About the old man.
Came down.
And what is the story of this story of the old man? In a nutshell.
David wants him to come with him because of the things the interaction between the two.
Right,
and
right.
he says, no, I'm old.
I'm old, and I'm not, so I'm not going to do it. But he's with David right on the Jordan, ready to cross to Gilgal. Okay? Now, who shows up? Who comes to David as he's getting ready to cross the river back into his kingdom? Well, in 41, yeah.
Oh, 41, oh, okay.
Because we've got this whole little deal with the old man and as he's approaching the river.
Yeah, because he wants his servant to cross over.
Right.
He tells David to have the servant cross over with him.
So David's is getting ready to cross over. Who shows up when he's getting ready to cross the Jordan? Back into his kingdom.
Israelites.
Oh, we got Israelites showing up. And what do the Israelites say?
They have more right to the king than Judah.
So here's David re-entering his kingdom. The Israelites come, and which is really interesting. How are the Israelites presented? Israelites. How are the people of Israel presented?
The man, it says.
Okay, you got men there.
And they're angry.
They're angry men. You got to be careful with angry men.
They supported Absalom.
They supported. Who are the Israelites here as they're presented here, which becomes really important later in the story, because this is a sort of the redactor writing something that we're not really thinking about yet, but they will be shortly. Who are the people of Israel?
The other 10.
That's it. They're the other 10 tribes, because they are irritated with Judah. The 10 tribes. So we right here we get a division, right? We've got these 10 tribes that say, hey, we got one king, right? He represents 12 tribes, and we're
10 of them.
10 of them, right? We're 10 of the tribes. You're one. And Simeon is somewhere hanging around there in the south. But you're only one. And what does Judah say? What do the representatives of Judah say?
We did it because he's closely related to us.
Yeah. Well, he's part of Judah. He's part of our people. And Israel says, well, we got 10 shares, 10 of the 12 shares. Who was nastier in this little argument that they're having on the bank of the Jordan? Which side is nastier? Judah is nastier. Their words were fiercer. than the Israelites. So what do we have now? Again, David, this should be a time of triumph, right? David's re-entering his kingdom. He's defeated this rebellion. He's going back to the city of David. He's restoring his kingship, right? And what's going on the banks of the Jordan?
They're bickering.
They're bickering. This confederation, they're bickering with one another. Who is there? Who is also there as they're bickering? Well, we're 10 of us, so there's only one of you. Yeah, but we're better because the king is one of us. Who's there? Who's listening? In chapter 20. Sheba's listening. And we have no opinion about Sheba, right? The writer gives us no insight into the quality of this person, right? He's a troublemaker, right? So we know immediately that this isn't a good guy. The writer tells us it's not, so we don't want to trust him, right? He's a Benjaminite too. And Benjaminites, Shema was the one throwing stones. He's a Benjaminite. Saul was a Benjaminite. Remember in the end of Judges, the tribe of Benjamin almost got wiped out. Benjamin doesn't have a great history. Okay, so what's that?
Oh, I'm just reading.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Now there's a
a
conflict, right, at the banks of the Jordan. That you got the 10 tribes versus the one tribe, and they're going back and forth and back and forth. And what does Sheba do? That scoundrel, that troublemaker.
Rebels against David.
He rebels, right? And he says, what does he do? What does he want to do?
He wants the men to follow, the Israelites to follow him.
10 tribes, come with me. This isn't like Absalom, right? Because Absalom was doing what? Because he was from the tribe of Judah. What was Absalom trying to do? Take control of the whole Shmear, right? But Sheba is only interested in the 10 tribes. So he's going to take the 10 tribes and go. And do they go?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. They do. And so what ends up being the result?
The men of Judah stay with David.
So the men of Judah stay with David and they go back to Jerusalem. But he's lost a big hunk of his kingdom, right? Because now we've got another. Boy, it just gets better and better for David, right? He just defeated his son and now he is facing another. I guess Absalom was more like a civil war. This is, well, if you talk about dividing, this is two different kinds of civil war.
Kind of back to where we started with Saul's son.
Okay, tell me.
That had the 10 tribes.
Yes. And that's going to be important. Why? And we mentioned it when we talked about when it was divided then. Why does that become so pertinent? Why does it become pertinent in this story as the redactor is shaping these stories about David? Because the writer is writing to people that know about the division between Judah and the other 10 tribes. That hasn't happened yet as two separate countries that have a longer history. But the reader of this work, they know. So it's something that I think he's introducing to the story, something that a reader would say, oh, now I get it. When did it start happening? When did the division begin to happen? And the 10 tribes are not going to come out looking good. They're the ones that rebel. They're the ones that separate themselves from God's anointed. Important just to file away. Where do you think the writer of this story, or the redactor of this story, where do you think he lives? Just a guess.
Judah.
He lives in Judah. And Judah they are always going to come out on top. Judah's always going to be the better of the two. Now, there are going to be a lot of stinkers, kings that are bad in Judah, but there will never be a good king in Israel. Never a good king. Never. The big reason is Solomon's going to build a temple in Jerusalem, and that's where you worship the Lord God, in Jerusalem. Israel, they can't worship their God in Jerusalem because Jerusalem's in foreign country. So you better have your God better live in your country. So they're going to build a temple to the Lord God. But if you live in Judah, that's not the temple. The temple is in Jerusalem. And we're going to hear that over and over, and even more in the books of the Chronicles. Boy, they really pound on that Israel cannot be right because they don't worship God in Jerusalem, which they can't do because Jerusalem's in another country. So they can't do it. So he's back. What is he? He does something to the concubines. What does he do to the concubines? And we know the story about Absalom and the concubines. He's going to give them a pension, but that's about it. What does he do to further solidify his position? So he doesn't take the concubines again because that's what Absalom did. Although that could be establishing his authority because that's what Absalom did when they were a sign of power. Who shows up in the story? Amasa. And what does he tell Amasa to do? Because we got a rebellion, right? What does he tell Amasa to do?
To summon the men of Judah.
You gotta rally the forces. We gotta do what? We gotta get Sheba, right? Now, what is the problem with Sheba? And through David's lips, we kind of get an idea of the problem with Sheba. What's the problem with Sheba? Why does he tell Amasa to get the tribe of Judah together? Because we got to get this guy. Why? Why is that so important?
Because David said that Sheba will do us more harm than Absalom.
Why is Sheba actually more dangerous to David than Absalom?
Because he's not family.
Because he's not family. He's not family. He has an appeal to those 10 tribes. They can rally around him. Absalom was always going to be from Judah. The same kind of division was going to be there with Absalom. But Sheba, he can marshal those 10 tribes. And we're going to see later in the story, Israel's going to be much stronger because they have a higher population than Judah. Will always have a higher population. So he's a real problem. So they go after him before he does what? We got to get him before.
He gets us.
Yeah. Well, what is he looking to do? What is Sheba? What's he afraid? What's David afraid Sheba is going to do?
He's going to get the 10 tribes.
Well, 10 tribes, but he's going to hide out. He's going to build fortified cities.
Yeah.
So we can't give him. Remember, we saw that with Absalom. When he got the advice, don't go. The advice of Abathar was we got to get him right away before he, gets too far away. And the bad advice was, you could wait. That's not a big deal. And it turned out to be bad. David says we need to get this guy before he builds a hideout that we're not going to be able to break. Okay, so Amasa is heading out, right? Who else goes out to get Sheba? So Amasa with people from Judah, because he was Absalom's general. He's got ties with Judah. He's bringing people with him. David's got an army. Who's leading David's army out? Joab is leading David's army out. But you got 2 generals, which is one general too many. And Joab is being Joab. What does Joab end up doing?
He stabs them also.
He ends up stabbing, and he does it in, how does he do it?
He went to Shuri.
What's that? Yeah, he doesn't do it like 2 soldiers facing one another. He has the sword and he runs him through. Now, has Joab done this before? Yeah. He did it with Abner. He did it with Uriah. He did it with Absalom. He's doing it now. And by killing Amasa, what has he in essence done? What
He's taking it.
has he helped David? Is he helping David? Because the other times you could say, oh, he did it because he was helping David.
No, he's helping himself.
No, he's not helping David. As a matter of fact, he's really hurting David. Why is he hurting David by killing Amasa?
Because those people were under Amasa.
Yeah, you got an army under Amasa, and you kill the general. All these soldiers that are loyal to him, they could, even though they're from Judah, they could
Give it to him.
just go home or switch sides. But they were fighting David. Not long ago. When they were following Amasa because Amasa said so. Now Amasa's gone. This is not something good for David, but it shows again something about Joab's character. And what can we say about Joab's character? Is it Joab somebody that you trust?
Yeah, Job's for himself.
Yeah, he seems like he's very focused on himself, is aware of himself, wants him to be in a better position. What ends up happening with Amasa's army? Do they go back? No, they don't. They don't. Even though Amasa's gone and he's thrown in a field, his army continues to follow Joab, right? It's still following Joab. So Sheba, they're after Sheba, right? Where does Sheba go?
Through the tribes of Israel.
Okay, going through Israel, because that's where he's got his support from these other tribes. And he still holds up in a little town, right? And what's the little town he holds up? He finds to hold up in.
It's Abel.
Little town of Abel, right? And what does Joab do with his army? So Sheba's in Abel, and what does Joab do with his army?
Besieged.
Okay, besieges the city. Now, understand, sieges in the ancient world, they could last years. Because if you had food, there was no way, if the walls were big enough, you weren't going to go over the walls. No way to take those walls down. And if you had enough food inside, and they weren't stupid, that's what they did with the cities. Sieges could last a long time. So besieging the city is not necessarily a great thing. That's what David didn't want to happen. Sheba going to a fortified city, but that's where he is. But Joab catches a break. What's his break?
When the wise woman wants to talk to him.
Okay, when the woman shows up and from the city. And what does she offer? What's her deal with Joab?
She'll hand over Sheba.
Okay, they strike a deal, the woman. If the woman does what?
Gives them Sheba.
Gives him Sheba, then he'll leave. Because sieges are also, bad, even though they could last years. Inside, when you run out of food, you run out of food. When you run out of water, you run out of water. So sieges can be bad. We'll withdraw if you give Sheba. Does she give him Sheba?
Yeah.
Yeah. How does she give him Sheba? Well, she doesn't give him all of Sheba, right? She gives Sheba, or gives Joab what?
It says,
Which, again, we always look for lessons. This is how one can get ahead in life. Thank you, Barb. Thank you. I didn't even get a courtesy chuckle from anybody but you. I appreciate that.
You're
that
welcome.
means a lot to me.
He told us to start with, you were off today.
Yeah.
Oh,
I am.
No coffee.
yeah.
No coffee, I'm impressed.
oh.
Yeah, what's that?
Yeah.
Coffee, no coffee.
No coffee either. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems. Yeah. So there's a lot
And you're
of,
still awake.
yeah, it's
you know.
pretty amazing. I think it's because I'm holding her.
She's,
But she, yeah. Okay, so we've got, and what does Joab do after he gets Sheba's head? Okay, he returned to Jerusalem. So what has happened here? What has happened in this? Because then we move into something else. You know, there's a little break. What's going on here?
so Joab has just shown his power.
Joab has exerted a lot of power. You know, Joab is showing more king-like qualities than David. You know, although very self-interested, and his morality is questionable. He tends to be kind of amoral. But Joab is certainly the one who has power. Now, we've got this little thing, and remember, when we look at Scripture, always want to think about, why is it there? Because there's a reason. There's got to be a reason why something is there. Now, sometimes I look at it and say, I have no idea why they put this in here. But there's a reason, I just don't know it. These 23 through 25. What's going on in 23 through 25? I mean, we have this story, this narrative that's really well written. You know, has drama, has characters, has plot. You got a lot of stuff going on. And then in 23 through 25, what do we have?
The officials.
We got officials. Sort of a roster of officials. Some of whom we already know, right? Mm-hmm. Why did the writer put this in? Understanding that every word he wrote cost him money. It's not like me writing on my computer. I can write thousands of words. It makes no difference, because it says no cost. But remember, they're writing on papyrus. That's expensive. So every single word he puts, he's got to have a reason for doing it because there's a cost involved. Why do you think he includes this?
It's more definitive of the breakdown of the area.
Yeah, well, it's a definitive breakdown of the area. So the people who read it know that we've got a structure.
Where before it was just the king. It was
Right.
over a territory.
So now we've got an idea that he's got an administration, that he has got a government. This kind of reflects a government. What are the different offices? He gives names. What are the different offices? Forgetting the names.
The offices.
Yeah, what are the different offices? We got different people in charge of different things, right? And what are the things over which they have charge?
Labor.
Okay, what?
Forced labor.
Oh.
Slavery.
Forced labor. Huh. Somebody had talked about forced labor a long time ago and associated it with kings. Samuel
You
said.
didn't want a king from
Because kings will enslave you and make you do their work. And here David and his administration has an office of forced labor. Kind of interesting, I think, that would be one of the offices that he listed. The guy who's in charge of forcing labor. That maybe this is just a little subtle reminder that kings are not always wonderful. Because they force you to work. And they force you to work on the stuff they want you to work on. So we have this story of David. When we get here, what is now David's situation?
Back in Jerusalem.
He's back in Jerusalem. What else can we say? He's endured 2 rebellions, right? 2 civil wars. Different, one with his son and one with Sheba, but he survived them, and he's won.
Is this breakdown of offices, so to speak, because of his weakness?
It could be that he's not doing this on his own. that he's not, he has to delegate. That could be. Since I think that becomes a theme, that would sure fit in with that theme. I don't know that I'd ever even thought of that before, but that could be. I've always, when I've looked at it, I've seen that forced labor stand out. But yeah, that could be. Might be a good interpretation of what the writer, because what we're trying to do is try to figure out what this redactor is doing. What message does he have for us? What does he want us to take away from his story? Who appears to be calling the shots in the kingdom, this David's reestablished kingdom? Who seems to have?
Joab?
Joab sure seems to be the one that has the power, and not David.
And that was by his design, his shrewdness.
Yeah, Joab, he's sharp. He is shrewd. As we look at the story, though, why is David in this situation where one of his generals seems to have more power than he?
He's become weak over time.
Why?
Because Joab knows his secret, his original sin of killing
Okay,
Uriah.
remember, this is God's story. Why is David becoming weaker?
Consequences.
Because there are consequences of his action. God said this was going to happen through Nathan. This is what's happening. He's gone through 2 rebellions, right? It can't get worse, right? It can't get worse for David.
Never say never.
Yeah. We'll finish the David story next week because it does get worse. And
God told him that there would be confusion that would continue throughout his family, so it's not done yet.
it's not done yet. And David's decline is not finished. It's not finished. I talked to somebody this last week, and he used David as an example, and it was interesting that behavior doesn't have consequences. That David did these things, but God was there, and he always triumphed. And I said to him, "Have you read the story? Have you read the David story?" And he says, "Well, yeah, I know David killed Goliath." And I said, "Did you read the whole thing?" Because after Bathsheba, I don't think you can read the David story and say, "Oh, God just blessed him up a storm and had no consequences," because David's a mess after the Bathsheba story. And what's going to be really interesting is when we get into the books of the Kings, the same thing's going to happen to his son. Darn it. The same thing's going to happen to his son. Yeah. Well, it's a God story. And it's when God's in control of it. And when you do what God says don't do, you pay consequences.
Nap time.
Yeah. Well, lunch and cheese time.
Oh,
yeah.
yes.
Lunch and cheese time.
Oh,
all right. Any questions about this? These are stories we don't usually talk about. Mm-hmm. You don't usually hear these stories, but they're there, and I think they're
important.
Yeah, they're important because they're there. They're important because they're there.
I took your lead and I jumped into the book of Chronicles because you said, "Don't read the book of Chronicles."
Yeah.
And so after I got past the first 11 or 12 chapters, which were all chronology and genealogy, it did start to review very quickly all the things we've talked about. Mm-hmm. But there was one thing in there that I've either missed, or in Chronicles it talked about the sin that he committed was when he was counting he took a census of his troops. Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about that, have we?
What's next?
David?
Coming up.
You're saying David?
I
got ahead of myself this week.
It's not mentioned, because I also led to the end of Samuel, and it's
Last
not
week I was
mentioned.
behind.
Why? And because it never mentioned Bathsheba in Chronicles.
That's right. when I'll talk about a redactor. And again, I just want to make sure we're on the same. A redactor is someone who takes stories that exist and sort of puts them into a narrative. So if you got a whole bunch of stories, in a sense, the evangelists are redactors because they take these stories of Jesus and they shape it into a gospel. They don't just take one narrative, they shape independent stories that are being circulated. And as they do it, they have their own perspective. Well, maybe all historians are in a sense, but they've got their own perspective on where the story should lead you, the lessons that they want you to learn. And so all the books of Samuel and Kings and the Chronicles are both stories written by, or narratives written by redactors, taking similar stories and shaping it to teach a lesson. But the two lessons are different because the redactors are different. The writer of, and we're going to see this as we get into Kings, the writer, the redactor of the books of Samuel and Kings, I think, is a person from Judah, because it's almost always done from a Judah perspective. You may have some Judean kings that are good, or kings of Judah that are good, but you'll never have an king of Israel that's good. None of them are going to be righteous, not a single one of them. So it seems to be written from his perspective. Far more interested in how God is leading and shaping, the people as they move through their history. Books of Chronicles, I think, was written by somebody else, probably later because of the language. It's more Aramaic than Hebrew, so the language is a little different. It would appear to be written by people who are very focused on numbers, on counts. That's why you have all that genealogy. Now, do you remember when we ran into genealogy before? And it may be before y'all came, but y'all who've been with me, you remember when we ran into a lot of genealogy?
Back here.
Well, Leviticus, you could even go back all the way back to Genesis, where you have these long, so-and-so begot so-and-so, yada, da, da, da. And when we were talking about Genesis, one of the things I said is, Genesis seems to be, again, a redactor putting it together, but strands coming from different sources, really different sources. That's why in the Noah story, is it 2 of every kind or is it 7 of every clan? You can't be both. It can't be both. But they're different strains that are being. There would appear to be a strain where whoever's coming up with these stories really focuses on numbers. The names are important. The numbers are important. Detail, size is important. How big a building is important. It's not important to this writer at all. It's not important. It is important to the people who are writing Chronicles. Now, a lot of people who study this far more than me have suggested that it may be the priests are the ones that are writing, or a priest is shaping Chronicles, that is written from a priestly perspective. There's some other evidence. The temple is way more important in Chronicles than it is in these works. So it would appear, and the priests seem far more interested in getting those numbers right, the generations correct, and that seems to be the perspective in Chronicles. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that the writer of Chronicles either didn't know about or didn't think was important. What David did, that moral choice was unimportant. What is important is, if you're told to count, you better count correctly. That's what's important, because that's important to me. And that becomes the greater sign of sin. Now, this is Word of God. So we're talking about different perspectives. That means both are important. We can read that and say, well, one isn't more important than the other. Both are important. Just like when we read the Gospels. I hope nobody gets worried about the fact that, three of the Gospels end at a different, Jesus says something different as his last words in 3 of the Gospels. That shouldn't bother us, because they're not written to be historical pieces. They're written to be gospels, expressions of faith. And so each of the evangelists see Jesus in a slightly different way, and that shapes their story. That's how they shape their story. So of course they end on a slightly different note. And I hope we don't worry about it. If we worry about it, I think that's unfortunate, because I think then we're...
It's a good word.
Well, it's unfortunate because
I like it.
we end up putting
absolutely.
what we're doing is we're putting this reason, our idea that history is truth, and therefore it's got to be scientific and historical to be true. That's our perspective. That wasn't the perspective of the people who wrote it, nor the people who read it originally. They were looking for something deeper than a historical narrative. They were looking for what is faith, who is Christ. And I think that's what we have in the books of Samuel and Kings versus Chronicles. There was a book that wasn't included in the canonical Old Testament by anybody, but it existed, called the Book of the Jubilees. And the Book of the Jubilees was a story from, again, this Chronicles perspective of Genesis and Exodus. That was the Book of the Jubilees. So it was a retelling of Genesis, but from this perspective, where numbers are important and structure of worship is important and details are really important. Keep on reading. Have you read about the temple? Have you in Chronicles? Lord have mercy.
Oh, yeah.
That's painful when you go all the details about where you put gold and what's made of this and what's made of that, because that's the redactor believed that's crucially important, that it's done in this
It's exacting.
way. Yeah, they may have been the precursors of Presbyterians, because we like things done decently and in order. Lord have mercy. We don't do anything fast. It's got to be slow. We refer to committees and briefs until we research it to death. So that's that. But that's that. But you can see that, I think. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good. I'm going to hit the button. We're going to have a word of prayer and then go. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. Remind us, if we take nothing else from this David story, remind us that behavior has consequences. And that when we face the consequences, we can still do it with faith and confidence, assured of your love and your grace, even though life may not be as easy as we would like it to be. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay.